A warm breeze brushed through the air as Jocelyn Walsh crouched by the edge of the river, her son, Bodie Hendricks, toddling beside her. His tiny hands clutched a toy car, the wheels spinning wildly as he mimicked the sound of an engine. Jocelyn laughed, a soft, carefree sound, as Bodie grinned up at her, his bright eyes reflecting the sunlight dancing on the water. She reached out to fix his hat, her fingers brushing his curls. It was one of those moments that seemed untouchable, a picture of pure love and innocence. She kissed his cheek and said, "You'll always be my little sunshine." Bodie giggled, his laughter blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. But life, as it often does, hides its shadows where we least expect them. In December 2020, that laughter was silenced forever. Jocelyn Walsh, a young mother trying to build a better life, and her 3-year-old son, Bodie, became the center of a tragedy that would shatter a community and leave wounds too deep to heal. Their story is one of love, loss, and an unspeakable betrayal. What happened to Jocelyn and Bodie wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was something darker, something colder. It was planned. It was deliberate. And it was rooted in a rage so consuming, it left no room for humanity. This is the story of how their lives were stolen by someone they trusted. A man who let his grief twist into hatred, who allowed his anger to grow into something monstrous. And it all began with a moment no one could have predicted, the loss of an unborn child. The voice becomes quieter, almost as though carrying the weight of the words themselves. This is not an easy story to tell, and it will not be an easy story to hear. But some stories must be told, no matter how heavy they are. Because behind every headline is a person, and behind every statistic is a family left to pick up the pieces. Jocelyn Walsh and Bodie Hendricks deserve to be remembered for who they were. Innocent, loving, and full of life. The voice hardens slightly, as if preparing the listener for the unraveling truth. The crime that shook the city of Cincinnati didn't just end lives. It began a painful search for answers. Why would someone do this? What could drive a person to commit such unimaginable acts? And how did no one see it coming? A moment of silence follows, the kind that demands attention. Then the voice resumes, softer but firm. In the end, this story isn't just about a mother and her son. It's about how grief and anger, left unchecked, can spiral into destruction. It's about the scars that tragedies leave behind, not just on those directly involved, but on entire communities. And it's about the importance of seeing the signs before it's too late. This is their story, and it begins, as all stories do, with hope. Jocelyn Walsh was the kind of person whose presence could light up even the darkest of days. To those who knew her, she was more than just a mother. She was a fighter. Life had thrown challenge after challenge her way, yet she faced every single one with a quiet strength that inspired those around her. Jocelyn was a young single mother, raising her 3-year-old son, Bodie Hendricks, with unconditional love. She didn't have much, but what she did have, she poured into her son. Her life hadn't been easy. Jocelyn had experienced heartbreak, betrayal, and loss. Yet, she held on to hope. She had dreams of creating a better future for Bodie. She wanted more than just survival. She wanted a life filled with stability and happiness for her little boy. Jocelyn worked tirelessly to provide for him. Days often blended into nights as she juggled part-time jobs, stretched every dollar, and sacrificed her own needs to ensure Bodie never went without. But even in the midst of her struggles, Jocelyn found joy in life's smallest moments. It wasn't the big things that brought her happiness. It was the sound of Bodie's laughter when they played hide and seek in their tiny apartment. It was the way he clutched her hand on walks to the park or the silly faces he made when she tried to teach him to eat vegetables. At bedtime, she would sit by his side, reading his favorite stories, her voice filled with warmth and love. "You're my little sunshine," she would whisper as he drifted off to sleep, a peaceful smile on his face. But behind Jocelyn's radiant smile was a woman carrying a heavy burden. Her life had become a balancing act, one that required constant resilience. She rarely had time to focus on herself, her dreams often pushed to the side. And while she loved Bodhi more than anything in the world, the weight of single motherhood often left her feeling isolated. She didn't have much of a support system, which made her vulnerable in ways she couldn't fully recognize. And then there was Beckham Tucker. When Jocelyn first met Beckham, he seemed like a breath of fresh air. He was attentive, charming, and quick to offer her the emotional support she had been missing. Beckham presented himself as someone who could fill the gaps in Jocelyn's life. He listened to her stories, laughed at her jokes, and made her feel seen. To Jocelyn, it felt like maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who truly cared about her and Bodhi. But Beckham Tucker wasn't the man he appeared to be. Beneath the surface, there was something darker, something that wasn't immediately visible. Beckham wasn't just quiet, he was calculating. His attentiveness wasn't about understanding Jocelyn, but about controlling her. Over time, subtle signs began to emerge. Beckham would make comments about Jocelyn's choices, what she wore, where she went, or who she spent time with. He claimed it was because he cared, but it became clear that his care came with conditions. Friends of Beckham described him as reserved, someone who kept to himself. But those closest to him spoke of an intensity that lurked behind his calm demeanor. Beckham had a temper, one that didn't surface often but was impossible to ignore when it did. He had a way of fixating on things, his emotions often simmering just below the surface. And when Jocelyn miscarried their baby, those emotions boiled over in ways no one could have foreseen. For Beckham, the miscarriage wasn't just a personal loss, it was an affront. He couldn't see it as an accident or a tragedy. In his mind, it became something Jocelyn had caused, something she had done to him. His grief twisted into resentment, and that resentment festered. Beckham became obsessed with the idea that Jocelyn had taken something from him, and in his warped mind, he began plotting a way to take something from her in return. At the center of this heartbreaking story is Bodhi Hendricks, the light of Jocelyn's life. Bodhi was 3 years old, a bundle of energy and curiosity. He was the kind of child who could make anyone smile, even on their worst day. With his messy curls, wide eyes, and love of adventure, Bodhi was a picture of pure innocence. He adored Paw Patrol and would eagerly recite the characters' names to anyone who would listen. His favorite treat was ice cream, and he'd often get it smeared all over his face, much to Jocelyn's amusement. He loved running through the park, his tiny legs carrying him as fast as they could go, with Jocelyn always a step behind, laughing as she tried to keep up. To Jocelyn, Bodhi wasn't just her son. He was her whole world. He gave her life meaning in ways nothing else ever could. Every decision she made, every long shift she worked, every dream she put on hold, was for him. He was her motivation to keep going, even on the hardest days. That's what makes this story so devastating. Bodhi was a symbol of everything good in Jocelyn's life. He was her hope for a brighter future. And in the end, it was that light, so pure and so full of life, that was extinguished by the darkness Beckham Tucker carried within him. In the beginning, Jocelyn Walsh believed she had finally found someone who could share her life, someone who could love her and her son, Bodhi, unconditionally. Beckham Tucker had presented himself as a caring and understanding partner, and for a while it felt real. Jocelyn, who had faced life's challenges largely on her own, welcomed the idea of having someone by her side. But relationships are not built on appearances alone, and cracks in their bond began to form far earlier than anyone realized. The turning point came when Jocelyn miscarried the baby she was expecting with Beckham. For her, the loss was devastating. It wasn't just the physical toll, but the emotional pain of losing a future she had begun to imagine. Jocelyn grieved quietly, trying to stay strong for Bodhi, while also coming to terms with the life that had slipped away. But Beckham's reaction was nothing like hers. Where Jocelyn sought healing and understanding, Beckham became cold, withdrawn, and bitter. To him, the miscarriage wasn't just a tragedy. It was an accusation. According to her friends, Jocelyn confided that Beckham began making comments that left her feeling uneasy. He implied, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that the miscarriage was her fault. He didn't outright blame her, but his words carried an edge that cut deep. "If you had just been more careful," he told her once. Jocelyn tried to explain that it wasn't her fault, that sometimes these things happen, but Beckham wouldn't hear it. He began to resent her, and that resentment started to seep into every part of their relationship. Her friends noticed the change in Jocelyn almost immediately. Faith Burton, one of Jocelyn's closest confidants, described her as being more reserved, more hesitant in her words and actions. "She wasn't herself," Faith recalled. "It was like she was walking on eggshells around him. And Jocelyn, she's not like that. She's strong, but he had a way of making her doubt herself." Faith and others began urging Jocelyn to leave Beckham, but it wasn't that simple. He had already started to isolate her, cutting her off from those who cared about her. Beckham wasn't overtly violent, but his control was insidious. He would question Jocelyn about where she had been, who she had spoken to, and why she needed to spend so much time with her friends. Slowly, her world began to shrink, and Beckham became the center of it. And then, Beckham's anger turned into something darker. Jocelyn noticed that he wasn't just cold and distant, he was unpredictable. Small disagreements would lead to explosive arguments, with Beckham shouting and accusing her of being selfish or ungrateful. One night, after a heated exchange, Jocelyn called Faith in tears. "He's scaring me," she said. "I don't know what to do." But by the next morning, Jocelyn had brushed it off, telling her friend that everything was fine, that Beckham had apologized, that he'd promised to change. But he never did. If anything, his behavior only got worse. Jocelyn wasn't just dealing with Beckham's anger. She was also navigating his obsession. He became fixated on the idea of control. Control over Jocelyn, control over her time, and eventually control over her son, Bodhi. Jocelyn's friends noticed that she became increasingly reluctant to leave Bodhi alone with Beckham. "I don't trust him," she admitted to Faith one day. "There's just something about the way he looks at Bodhi sometimes. It's like he's angry at him for no reason." Beckham's fixation wasn't limited to Jocelyn and Bodhi, though. He began to obsess over the miscarriage. He brought it up in conversations constantly, often in ways that were cruel and accusatory. "You don't even care," he told her once. "If you cared, you wouldn't have let this happen." Jocelyn would try to defend herself, but Beckham's words would cut her off, leaving her feeling helpless. Faith described one conversation where Jocelyn admitted, "I feel like I'm losing myself. He makes me feel like everything is my fault." It wasn't just Jocelyn who noticed Beckham's spiraling behavior. Analia Barr, one of Beckham's few close friends, told investigators that he had started making alarming statements. He told her that he felt like Jocelyn had taken something from him, something he could never get back. "She killed my baby," he told Analia. "She killed my baby, and she doesn't even care." Analia didn't know how to respond to him. "It was like he wasn't even the same person," she said. "There was this darkness in him that I had never seen before." The relationship between Jocelyn and Beckham was crumbling, but by the time Jocelyn fully realized the extent of the danger she was in, it was too late. Beckham's bitterness and anger had transformed into a terrifying obsession, and Jocelyn's efforts to protect herself and her son weren't enough to stop what was coming next. It was in this fractured state, Jocelyn living in fear and Beckham consumed by rage, that the events leading to the unthinkable began to unfold. As Beckham Tucker's anger festered, it began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just bitterness anymore. It was a growing storm of resentment, blame, and an insatiable need for retribution. Those closest to him, like Analia Barr, started to notice the shift. Beckham was no longer the quiet, reserved man they had known. He was consumed, spiraling deeper into his own twisted sense of justice. Analia, who had been Beckham's confidant for years, later recounted the chilling conversations she had with him during this time. At first, it was subtle. Beckham would vent about Jocelyn, about how she didn't understand his pain, about how she seemed to move on after the miscarriage while he was left to carry the weight of it. But then, his words became sharper, more accusatory. One night, he called Analia, his voice cold and detached. "She killed my baby," he said. "She took my child away from me." Analia tried to reason with him, reminding him that miscarriages happen and that it wasn't Jocelyn's fault. But Beckham wouldn't listen. In his mind, Jocelyn had become the villain. She wasn't just the woman he once loved. She was the person he blamed for all his pain. And that blame started to turn into something far more dangerous. During one of their final conversations, Beckham made a statement that would haunt Analia forever. His voice was eerily calm, the kind of calm that masks something far more sinister. "If she killed my baby," he said, "I'll take hers." Analia froze, unsure if he meant it or if it was just his anger talking. She tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but Beckham didn't. He repeated the sentence, this time with even more conviction. "She killed my baby, so I'll take hers. Then she'll know what it feels like." Analia didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she didn't believe Beckham would actually act on those words. He was angry, yes, but the idea of him harming Jocelyn or Bodhi seemed unthinkable. On the other hand, there was something about the way he said it, calm, deliberate, that made her uneasy. She later admitted to investigators that she thought about warning Jocelyn, but she didn't. "I didn't think he was serious," Analia said. "I thought it was just him being dramatic. If I'd known—" Her voice trailed off, the weight of her regret too heavy to put into words. But Beckham was serious. In his mind, his plan was taking shape. He started watching Jocelyn more closely, noticing her habits, her routines. He became more controlling, demanding to know where she was at all times. Friends of Jocelyn later said that she often felt like she was being watched, like Beckham was always just one step behind her. "She told me she felt trapped," Faith Burton said. She said she was scared of what Beckham might do, but she didn't want to believe he was capable of actually hurting her or Bodhi. But Beckham's intentions were crystal clear. To him, this wasn't just revenge. This was about control, about making Jocelyn feel the same pain he believed she had caused him. And the most horrifying part of all was that he had decided Bodhi would be the one to pay the price. As Beckham's conversations with Analia grew darker, so did his actions. He started making preparations, buying items that would later become pieces of evidence in the investigation. His calmness during this time was unsettling. He wasn't acting impulsively, he was planning. Every move was deliberate, every decision calculated. And all the while, Jocelyn had no idea just how much danger she and her son were in. The words Beckham spoke to Analia, "If she killed my baby, I'll take hers," would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him. But at the time, they were just words. Words that Analia didn't fully understand. Words that Jocelyn never heard. Words that carried a darkness no one could have anticipated. By the time anyone realized how serious Beckham was, it was already too late. On the surface, December 5, 2020, began like any other winter evening. Jocelyn Walsh, in her small Walnut Hills apartment, had spent most of the day tending to her 3-year-old son, Bodhi Hendricks. The apartment wasn't much, but it was their safe space. A place filled with toys, laughter, and fleeting moments of peace. Jocelyn had been trying her best to keep her life moving forward, unaware that Beckham Tucker was already putting a chilling plan into motion. Beckham had been preparing for weeks. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual about his movements. He ran errands, sent casual texts, and went about his day as though nothing was wrong. But behind closed doors, he was orchestrating a nightmare. Investigators would later uncover key pieces of evidence, each one pointing to the calculated nature of his crime. Among them was a chilling discovery. Beckham had purchased a body bag online just days before. The transaction was cold and methodical, made without hesitation, as if he had fully accepted the horrific act he was planning to commit. That evening, Beckham made his way to Jocelyn's apartment. He arrived unannounced, something he had done before. Jocelyn likely wasn't surprised to see him. Despite their fractured relationship, he often used Bodhi as an excuse to come by, insisting he needed to see the child. But this time was different. Beckham wasn't there to visit. He was there to end it all. The details of what happened inside Jocelyn's apartment that night are as harrowing as they are heartbreaking. Investigators believe that Beckham confronted Jocelyn about the miscarriage once again, reigniting the anger that had been simmering for weeks. It's likely that Jocelyn tried to defuse the situation, as she always did, but Beckham wasn't interested in reconciliation. His rage had reached its boiling point. At some point, the argument turned violent. Jocelyn, cornered in her own home, had no way to escape. Beckham, in a fit of uncontrollable anger, attacked her with a knife. The wounds he inflicted were brutal, deliberate. Each one spoke to the depth of his hatred, his need to hurt her as much as he believed she had hurt him. Jocelyn fought back. Her autopsy would later reveal defensive wounds on her hands and arms, a testament to her desperate attempt to survive. But Beckham overpowered her. And when it was over, the apartment fell silent, save for the faint sound of Bodhi playing in the next room. What happened next is perhaps the most chilling part of this entire story. Beckham didn't leave the apartment immediately. He stayed. For hours. Investigators believe he spent that time cleaning up, attempting to hide the evidence of what he had done. He wrapped Jocelyn's body in the very body bag he had purchased days earlier. He wasn't rushed, nor was he panicked. To him, this was all part of the plan. But Beckham wasn't finished. His twisted logic had led him to believe that Jocelyn's death alone wasn't enough. To truly make her pay, he needed to take away the one thing she loved most, her son. Sometime after midnight, Beckham walked into Bodhi's room. The little boy was likely asleep, clutching one of his favorite Paw Patrol toys. Beckham picked him up, placed him in his stroller, and quietly left the apartment. Witnesses later reported seeing a man pushing a stroller down the street in the early hours of the morning, though none of them could have imagined the horror that was about to unfold. Beckham made his way to the Ohio River, a place that would become forever linked to this tragedy. It was cold that night, the kind of cold that cuts through even the thickest jackets. The river was dark, its waters rushing relentlessly under the light of a distant moon. Beckham stood at the edge, the stroller by his side. It's unclear what thoughts went through his mind in that moment, if he hesitated, if he felt any remorse. But what we do know is that he made a choice. With the Ohio River's waters rushing below, Beckham took Bodhi from the stroller. He carried the 3-year-old to the edge of the bridge and, in one unthinkable act, let him go. The river swallowed Bodhi whole, its icy depths silencing the little boy forever. Beckham watched as the water carried him away, erasing the last traces of Jocelyn's light from the world. By the time the sun rose, Beckham had returned to Jocelyn's apartment. He placed her body into an Uber, telling the driver it was just luggage because he was moving out. The driver, unaware of the truth, took him to the river, where Beckham disposed of the body. He then walked away as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just committed two of the most horrifying acts imaginable. Jocelyn's body would be discovered days later, wrapped in the body bag Beckham had so carefully prepared. But Bodhi was gone. Despite exhaustive searches, his little body was never recovered. The Ohio River, vast and unyielding, became his final resting place. The crime Beckham committed wasn't impulsive. It wasn't the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. It was calculated, deliberate, and fueled by a rage that had consumed him completely. In taking the lives of Jocelyn and Bodhi, he didn't just destroy their future. He left an indelible scar on everyone who loved them and a community that would never be the same. Jocelyn Walsh's story is not an isolated tragedy. It's a stark reminder of the cracks in the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable among us. Her death, and the loss of her son, Bodhi Hendricks, are rooted in a web of issues that extend far beyond the actions of one man. Beneath the surface of this horrific crime lies a broader, unsettling truth. Jocelyn's story reflects the struggles faced by countless women and children every single day. Toxic relationships don't always begin with violence. Often, they start with charm, promises, and a facade of care, just as Jocelyn and Beckham Tucker's relationship did. But over time, toxic behaviors creep in. Subtle manipulations grow into overt control. Small arguments escalate into towering conflicts. And for women like Jocelyn, Leaving these relationships is far more complicated than simply walking away. For single mothers in particular, the stakes are incredibly high. Jocelyn was raising Bodhi on her own, working tirelessly to provide for him. To her, Beckham may have initially seemed like a lifeline, a partner who could lighten the load. But as the relationship deteriorated, Jocelyn found herself trapped. Financial insecurity, isolation, and the fear of losing custody of Bodhi likely weighed heavily on her decisions. Like so many others, Jocelyn faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Stay in a toxic relationship and try to manage the danger, or leave and risk even greater consequences. These pressures aren't unique to Jocelyn. Across the country, women in abusive or controlling relationships face similar dilemmas. And too often, the justice system falls short in offering them real protection. Temporary restraining orders, for example, can be effective in some cases, but they're just pieces of paper. They can't stop someone determined to harm another. In Jocelyn's case, there's no indication that she ever reported Beckham's behavior to authorities. This isn't unusual. Many women choose not to involve the police, either because they fear retaliation or because they doubt their concerns will be taken seriously. And unfortunately, they're often right to worry. There's also the unspoken stigma surrounding mental health and grief, particularly when it comes to men. Beckham Tucker's descent into darkness didn't happen overnight. His growing resentment after the miscarriage, his obsessive need for control, and his escalating anger all point to someone struggling with untreated mental health issues. But in our society, men are often discouraged from seeking help. Phrases like "man up" and "boys don't cry" create a culture where vulnerability is equated with weakness. This can lead to emotions like grief and sadness festering into something far more dangerous: anger, isolation, and, in cases like Beckham's, violence. This isn't to excuse Beckham's actions. What he did was horrifying and inexcusable, but his story highlights the critical need for better mental health resources and education, especially when it comes to addressing grief and loss. If Beckham had been taught to process his pain in healthy ways, if he had sought counseling after the miscarriage, would things have been different? It's a question that lingers, unanswered, but it's one worth asking. Jocelyn's death also underscores the vulnerabilities of single mothers in our society. Without strong support systems, women like her are left to navigate immense challenges on their own. Whether it's the financial strain of raising a child alone, the lack of affordable childcare, or the societal judgment that single mothers often face, the deck is stacked against them. These pressures create environments where toxic relationships can flourish. Partners like Beckham exploit vulnerabilities, using them as leverage to maintain control. And when these relationships turn dangerous, the warning signs are often ignored or dismissed by those in positions of authority. Faith Burton, one of Jocelyn's closest friends, spoke about how her concerns for Jocelyn were brushed aside. She told me he was scaring her, but when we talked about going to someone for help, she'd say, "What's the point? They won't listen until it's too late." Jocelyn's words are a chilling reflection of a system that often reacts to domestic violence rather than preventing it. By the time the alarm bells are loud enough for action, it's frequently too late to save lives like Jocelyn's and Bodhi's. Jocelyn's story is heartbreaking, not just because of what happened to her, but because it mirrors the stories of so many others. Every day, women and children face violence and coercion in their own homes. Every day, cries for help go unanswered. And every day, lives are lost because the resources to prevent these tragedies are either inaccessible or insufficient. But this isn't just about failures in the justice system. It's about societal attitudes that normalize control and manipulation in relationships. It's about the stigma that silences victims and the lack of accountability for perpetrators. It's about the glaring absence of resources for single mothers, survivors of domestic violence, and those struggling with untreated grief or mental illness. Jocelyn Walsh and Bodhi Hendricks deserved better. They deserved a world where Jocelyn's fears would have been taken seriously, where Beckham Tucker's spiraling behavior could have been intercepted, where support systems would have wrapped around Jocelyn and her son, giving them the protection they so desperately needed. Their story is not just their own. It's a reflection of the systemic failures that leave countless women and children vulnerable every day. And until we address these issues head-on, until we create a society where these tragedies are no longer possible, we will continue to fail those who need us most. The ripple effects of Jocelyn Walsh and Bodie Hendricks' deaths spread far and wide, touching everyone who had known and loved them. But for one man, the loss was a wound so deep, it defied words. Harold Shields, Bodie's biological father, was consumed by a grief that would alter the course of his own life. His son, the boy who had inherited his wide smile and infectious energy, was gone, and the circumstances of Bodie's death made the pain almost too much to bear. Harold Shields was not an absent father. Though he and Jocelyn were no longer together, he remained an active presence in Bodie's life. Weekends at the park, ice cream runs, long phone calls filled with Bodie's giggles. These moments had been the center of Harold's world. "Bodie was my boy," Harold told a family friend. "He was my reason for everything." The moment Harold learned what had happened to his son, something inside him broke. Losing a child is every parent's worst nightmare, but losing one under such horrific circumstances added an unbearable weight to his grief. Harold didn't just lose Bodie. He lost the chance to say goodbye, to protect his son from harm, to save him. And as the details of Beckham Tucker's crime came to light, that grief transformed into rage. Faith Burton, who remained close to the family throughout the aftermath, described Harold's state in the weeks following Bodie's death. "He was shattered," she said. "I've never seen someone so lost. He would call me in the middle of the night just crying. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He kept saying, 'How could someone do this? How could someone do this to a baby?'" But Harold's heartbreak wasn't just about loss. It was about the cruel way Bodie had been taken from him. "He kept thinking about Bodie's last moments," Faith said. "The fear he must have felt, the cold, the dark. Harold couldn't get those images out of his head. It drove him to the edge." That edge was where Harold found himself on the morning of Beckham Tucker's pretrial hearing. Beckham, charged with the murders of Jocelyn and Bodie, was in court to face the first steps of justice. Harold, sitting quietly in the courtroom, had been waiting for this moment, to see the man who had stolen everything from him. But when Beckham walked in, calm and emotionless, something inside Harold snapped. Surveillance footage from the Hamilton County Courthouse captured the moment Harold leapt from his seat. He didn't shout or hesitate. He charged straight at Beckham, striking him on the side of the head with a force fueled by unimaginable grief. Courtroom deputies quickly restrained Harold, pulling him away as the room erupted into chaos. But for Harold, it wasn't about creating a scene. It was about releasing the tidal wave of anger and pain that had consumed him since that terrible December night. Harold's outburst landed him in contempt of court. Judge Megan Shanahan sentenced him to 7 days in the Hamilton County Justice Center, though she acknowledged the depth of his anguish. "It was everything inside him," Faith said. "The pain, the rage. It just took over. He couldn't hold it in anymore." When Harold was released 3 days early, he returned to a life that would never feel whole again. "There's no closure for something like this," Faith said. "You can't just move on. How do you move on from losing your child like that?" But Harold wasn't the only one carrying the weight of Jocelyn and Bodie's loss. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the local community, leaving an indelible mark on everyone it touched. In the days and weeks following the crime, neighbors, friends, and even strangers came together to honor Jocelyn and Bodie's memory. Candlelight vigils were held across Cincinnati. People gathered in parks and community centers, lighting candles, saying prayers, and sharing stories about the young mother and her son. Jocelyn's closest friends spoke about her love for Bodie, about the way her face lit up whenever she talked about him. "She was such a good mom," Faith said at one vigil. "Bodie was her world, and she didn't deserve this." Neither of them did. The community also organized search efforts for Bodie's body. Despite exhaustive efforts by authorities, the Ohio River had yet to give up its secrets. Volunteers combed the riverbanks, waded into the icy waters, and spent hours searching for any trace of the little boy. But as days turned into weeks, Hope began to fade. "It's like he's just gone," one volunteer said. "We want to bring him home, but the river, it doesn't let go." For many, the absence of Bodhi's body became a symbol of the incompleteness of the tragedy. "It's like we can't lay him to rest," Harold said in a rare interview. "There's nowhere to go to talk to him, nowhere to leave flowers. He deserved more than this. He deserved to come home." Jocelyn and Bodhi's story left scars on everyone who heard it. For Harold Shields, it was a grief that would follow him for the rest of his life. For the community, it was a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly everything can change. And for the city of Cincinnati, it was a call to action, a demand for better protections for single mothers, for victims of domestic violence, and for families like Jocelyn and Bodhi's. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a heartbreak shared by everyone who knew them and everyone who wished they could have done something to save them. In the months following the horrific events of December 2020, Beckham Tucker stood before the court to face the consequences of his actions. The evidence was overwhelming, the pain in the courtroom palpable. Prosecutors announced their decision to pursue the death penalty, a sentence reserved for crimes so heinous, so inhuman, that no other punishment seems adequate. For Jocelyn Walsh and Bodhi Hendricks, the pursuit of justice had begun. But justice is not the same as closure. For Jocelyn's family, for Harold Shields, and for the community that rallied around them, the wounds left by this tragedy will never fully heal. Jocelyn was a loving mother who worked tirelessly to create a brighter future for her son. Bodhi was a beacon of joy, his laughter a light that touched everyone who knew him. Their lives were stolen far too soon, leaving an emptiness that can never truly be filled. But even in the face of such darkness, their memories live on. Jocelyn's friends continue to speak of her strength, her resilience, and the love she poured into her son every single day. Bodhi's father remembers him as a boy full of curiosity and wonder, a child whose smile could brighten even the gloomiest day. And the community, united in grief, continues to hold vigils, light candles, and speak their names to ensure they are never forgotten. For a family and a community, closure remains elusive. Jocelyn and Bodhi's story is one of love, loss, and the enduring hope that justice will prevail. Their lives may have been taken, but their spirits endure in the hearts of those who loved them. As the Ohio River continues its endless flow, so too will the memory of Jocelyn and Bodhi, an eternal reminder of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and the fight for a world where tragedies like this no longer happen. Thank you for watching this in-depth look at Jocelyn and Bodhi's story. If you want to see more content like this and help us continue shedding light on stories that must be told, please subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to honor the memories of those we've lost and keep their legacies alive. Jocelyn, Bodhi, we remember you.